Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Grow Rogue podcast. Today, I'm joined by Steve Linowes. Steve is a serial, I'm going to call it an entrepreneur and an entrepreneur. So he spent the first part of his career with Microsoft in the early days of the internet. And he's got a lot of really great stories about driving innovation at a time when innovation really meant innovation. And as an entrepreneur and an advisor to companies these days, he's driving innovation in the healthcare space, which is just ripe for disruption. And we have a great conversation about incentives and how to align your business so that your business benefits and so do the people involved. And so you're going to really enjoy this. Make sure you watch all the way through and leave a like and a comment and subscribe if you're not already subscribed on YouTube. All right, let's get started.
My background really is steeped in technology and being in a variety of technology environments. I have really been focused. Sometimes you look back on your life and you're like, how did I get here kind of thing? The common thread is really new technology, new markets, disruptive markets, and being able to bring new products, services, business models into those new markets and disruptive markets. And that's really the common thread throughout my entire career. More recently, I've gotten into healthcare, frankly, kicking and screaming going into healthcare, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But about 10, 12 years ago, actually 13 years ago now, I was the chief commercialization officer of a healthcare services company. We were the largest in our particular segment, and we grew the company from about 700 million to about $1.4 billion in 4 years, all organic growth. So huge amounts of growth associated with it. And again, disruptive markets, things were changing so much with our payer mix, with our services, all of those elements of what we were doing. So really exciting times, and it's a great time to be in healthcare, and healthcare is very ripe with disruption. More recently, I have been working in an advisory capacity with healthcare companies throughout the world, literally. So a lot in the US, but also a lot that are innovative digital health companies coming from other geographies. A lot coming from Israel specifically, and I'm helping Israeli companies that have great concepts and great minimal viable products, so great MVPs, but they're trying to figure out what is the product market fit in all of this. And so that's what I've been helping these companies in. And I do advisory work, so I invest, I find investors, I find people to help them go into new first customers, co-development partners, whatever it really takes for companies that are early stage companies to scale up here in the US market.
Well, thank you, Steve, for that background. And folks, if you're listening to this, I got to reiterate something, or I got to point back to something Steve said. He doubled revenue from 700 million to 1.4 billion. Now, if I say I doubled the revenue of my business, that's a little bit less impressive. We're talking about a 100% growth. We're talking about a $700 million, $700 million growth. So what does it take to make that kind of a transformational growth in a business of that size?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, to me, it really combines two things that can't be overlooked. The first one is focusing on customers. What are the customer needs, right? So if you're not laser focused on the customer, then you're never going to be successful in going and delivering any kind of value into the marketplace. So that's number one, is understanding the customer needs and where they're headed, so that you can make sure, as the analogy goes, you want to skate to where the puck will be, not to where the puck is, right? Or there are tons of other sports analogies in that vein. But that's number one, is laser focus on customers, and hearing what they're saying and hearing what they're not saying too. So it's about being an active listener with your customers. The second part of this is just what you and I talked about before we got started here today, is it's all about the product and services that you provide. There was a professor by the name of Kotler who wrote a very famous marketing book, and he talks about the 4 Ps of marketing, which I still think, 50 years later is still very appropriate even in this environment, which is, product is one of 4. You have product, price, place, or distribution, and promotion, right? Those are the 4 Ps, if my memory serves me properly. And the product is the key. You can have really horrible marketing, but a great product, and you'll still win the day. It would be helpful if you had great marketing on top of a great product, but the opposite is also true, which is if you have a crappy product and just great marketing, like with you guys at Grow Rogue, right? Where you can go and create all these eyeballs for it. If you have a crappy product, you're never going to be successful. So it all starts with the product. And I learned that in my days at Microsoft, when we were laser focused on products, and making sure that we understood why we were creating the products for the markets and really laser focusing on the value into the market.
So, Steve, I couldn't agree more. And we say this all the time, that sometimes the truth is that great marketing might be the worst thing that could happen to your business. And what I mean by that is that if your product isn't good,
right,
you're just going to make more people know that product isn't good, right? And it's not to diminish the value of starting with an MVP. You use that term. We use that term all the time. An MVP is not to be confused with a crappy product, right? We can't blame a crappy product on saying, well, it's just an MVP. That MVP needs to have, it's got to be viable. There's the important term there. The important V is the minimum viable product. Needs to provide some value, needs to be really quality, and needs to be getting better before, in my opinion, you start really pushing marketing heavily. So I'm glad you said that. I completely agree with you there.
And one thing that I would just add on to that, Reade,
Mhm.
is that you're absolutely right. The MVP isn't an excuse for anything. You really need to understand what your market segment is. And I want to talk about that in a second. And then what the best product people are not the people who tell you what can go into a product. The best product people are the ones who say, what are the things that should be in the MVP in order for it to get that initial traction?
Yeah.
Because I can tell you, and let's just take a look at the iPhone, the first iPhone, or I can give you tons of examples in technology over the years. But the first iPhone, actually, it was an iPod. The first iPod was not a really compelling thing. They attached music to a device, and they probably had 100 different songs that were available to be able to be connected to this one device. But to Steve Jobs' credit, he understood what the most basic design elements needed to be included in version 1 of that thing to begin getting people to understand the value of what that product was. And that's the most important thing. If he waited until everything was aligned for him to come up with the iPhone, then they would have never in a million years been able to launch the iPhone. So the MVP, it's really important to understand the market that you're targeting as well. The other thing that I think is a little bit of fool's gold on a product perspective is where people have come to me and said, listen, we're going after this market and it's $1 billion market. We're going to change healthcare. And you're like, okay, it's a multi-trillion-dollar market, right? So, and they come and say, well, if we only get 1% of $1 billion market, we're doing really well. Well, my contention with them is you've clearly not done a good job of segmenting your market and understanding who your customers are and the value proposition of this with your customers. And to me, if that is not aligned, you're never going to be successful. So focusing on the specific segment. Don't tell me that you're going after healthcare, because I can give you about 100 different subsegments of healthcare. Go after the specific segment that will allow you to achieve what you think your product or service can achieve with them.
Okay, so tell me if I am rephrasing this or if I'm re-explaining this incorrectly, because I think what you're saying, something that I resonate with a ton and something that we've talked about to a lot of our clients over the years, is to start from the first buyers and then build up. So what we tell them is if you can find a few people, it might be a few dozen, might be a few hundred, depending on the product. But let's say we're talking about something, B2B service type thing. There's going to be a few buyers that if you can prove, you can validate with people that are willing to give you money. Don't just tell me that you found through some database. There's a lot of people that theoretically would give you money, but if there's a few people that will give you money, then we like to build from there. Is that the right approach? Is that what you're describing?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're only able to do that because you further define the market segment that you're looking at, right? So if this is something that works really well with, I'm just going to give you a few examples of in healthcare. You have providers like health systems, you have managed care organizations like the Uniteds and Teens, Anthems of the world, and then you have self-funded health plans, which are enterprises of typically greater than a couple hundred people who actually fund their own healthcare for their employees, right? And you have to go to some kind of subsegment of each one of those to say, yes, this is exactly what I am going after, in order to say, this is a problem that this customer segment, it's not nice to have, it's critical for them to solve. If you go and you do nice to have stuff, it doesn't work out at all. So meaning like they'll love you to death, but they'll never buy. One other corollary to that, by the way, Reade, that I learned when I was in business school, was somebody came in, a venture capitalist came in and showed this graphic. And it was a really interesting graphic, which was basically, the whole asymptotic thing, right? Everybody does. And on the x-axis, it was number of words to describe your product. And on the y-axis, it was the amount of dollars that it takes to market your product. And basically, the gist of it is, if you have more words to describe the value of your product to your customers, it will cost you asymptotically more money in order to reach them. So unless you can do things like say, it's faster, better, cheaper, whatever is the value to that particular subsegment, that is the most critical thing that you can do. You got to hone your message, but the message is only honed if you make sure that the realization of the product to address that particular subsegment market's value, right?
Yeah.
And that's the only way that you can approach it. That's why I say you got to start with the product. It all starts with the product.
So, okay, I'm gonna reference an example you've already done, and we can kind of break this down and we can use this. So when you talk about finding product market fit, and I love that graph that you describe of the number of words you need to describe something being, correlated in a exponential sense to the cost to market it. Let's use the example of that iPod again. What was the description that Steve Jobs famously gave to describe the iPod? 1,000 songs in your pocket. 1,000 songs in your 5 words to describe a product, which I don't know that there has been, maybe there's been a few. I don't know that there's been very many products that have changed culture, that have changed the economy, that have, without sounding too pie in the sky, that have changed the world like that particular product. And he described the whole thing in 5 words.
Words, yeah. It's really a great, and there are a lot of examples. I will tell you that when I was working at Microsoft, it sounds kind of weird. There were 2 areas that I worked in that I look back on and I go, they had profound impact on our industry. One was creating digital video on our platform. You and I are having this interaction using digital video, using the underpinnings. And that was my first product at Microsoft, was something called Video for Windows. And it actually, so here's a little weird fun fact. It's the only product that Bill Gates and Andy Grove ever launched together. And I sat here and I said, why did Andy Grove care so much about this? And it was because he was CEO of Intel at the time and a smart guy. But this wouldn't move the needle for him financially, this one product. Mm-hmm. But what he realized was he needed to generate additional use cases for his microprocessors in order for people to continue upgrading their processors, right? Because digital video, I mean, we don't think about it now, but digital video requires so much horsepower, and especially back then, back in the 90s, that was non-trivial. And so that's why he did it, and it was amazing. The other part of this is the other product that I was segment was the internet. So my team at Microsoft was the first one to do anything with the internet. Internet Explorer 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, that was part of my team. We had the largest online launch event in the history of the internet to this day. There's been no other on a per capita basis, right? So on a relative scale, we had something like 35% of the internet came to our online launch event. You couldn't get that kind of size now, right? Mm-hmm. But that was back in 1995 for the Windows 95 launch event. So my point in saying this is we tackled new things, but we always had an eye towards the customer and brought that back to what would the customer need. I remember one other quick anecdote. I worked with our product team, with the developers, and I had this vision of, wouldn't it be great if Windows could update itself via online? And they said, that's the stupidest idea that I've ever heard. And it was one of these things where I was looking back then, you had dial-up and you had very few dedicated links, but we were sending out literally billions of diskettes to upgrade the operating system. And I was like, no. We got to put a platform in place in order to do Windows Updater. What everybody now, I updated twice this morning on my Windows machine. So I'm to blame for that if you want to accuse somebody. But it's one of these things where, why did I think about it? Because it was all about laser focused on the customer. What makes it easier for the customer? Was there value back to Microsoft? Sure. We didn't have to send out billions of disks, but it was what makes it easier for customers to consume our products.
Yep. So noting, blame Steve for Microsoft updates. Thank you. Yeah. Well, Steve, if I can, let's jump to today and let's talk healthcare a little bit. I know that that's the field that you're in right now. And so how are we taking this this focus on product first and then growing based on that? How are we doing that in healthcare, which is a notoriously, heavily regulated, super challenging, but definitely, I agree with you, ripe for disruption? What's that looking like right now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I can actually what I'd love to do is tell you what I'm working on today with a couple of partners.
Yeah.
Where we're contemplating what the heck do we want to do, right, in healthcare. And to me, this may be helpful to listeners because I'll give you like the raw process that we're going through, and we haven't figured it out yet, frankly. We don't know what we're going to do, but I'll give you sort of the process that our thinking is, and it's our process. And this is another thing that's really important for everybody. There's only one Steve Linowes in this world, thank God. There's only one Reade Milner in this world. There's only one. And so we have to be authentic to ourselves. You have your own operating system. What is your superpower, right? Figuring out what your superpower is and then applying it to what you want to do is really important. You have unique gifts. Each of us do. So go and own those and couple yourselves with other people who can complement what your superpowers are. So let me give you an example of what we're thinking about today. We came together, there are two other people and myself, and we said, one of them is the ex chief medical officer of a very large health system. The other is an entrepreneur in digital health who sold his company to a publicly held company for $500 million kind of thing. So very successful guys doing really interesting things. And we got together and we said, look, we want to do something that is important in healthcare because we're struggling with a lot of innovation in healthcare. If you take a look at healthcare, Accenture did a study. This is an interesting example of why healthcare is messed up. Accenture did a study on health, on different sectors of our economy. And in those 4 different sectors, it was products, services, it was healthcare, and government. Along those sectors of our economy, they figured out how growth was enabled along different metrics, whether they were they were labor, they were tech and innovation, or they were capital. And what they came out and showed was that healthcare was 99% labor. Their growth in healthcare was all due to labor. And negative 15% was due to technology and innovation. So when healthcare deployed innovation or technology, they went back and had negative growth as a result. So that's clearly a huge damn problem. But we realized that for us, we want to create systems that impact people's lives and not necessarily focus on impacting them directly. That was just something that we felt compelled to do. We didn't want to be providers of something, but we wanted to provide a system that did impact them. The other part of this that when you're thinking about it is you want to focus on the entities that have incentives to do something about it. So if you take a look at MCOs, I don't mean to belabor this point, but managed care organizations make money by and increase revenue by increasing fees associated with their insurance product. They don't necessarily have a huge value, or they don't have a huge incentive, I should say, to create more cost effectiveness or more effectiveness in treating patients or members. Mm-hmm. Providers are at health systems, they get paid on a fee for service basis, primarily. So more utilization and treating symptoms and not proactive treatment of problems is clearly something that they provide value back to them. And if they can add people to increase revenue, then they'll just do that. So they're not necessarily aligned with taking a look at innovations, and they're not very risk takers in health systems. So what we did was we said, okay, MCOs, forget about them. Health systems, not really that interesting. Where in the health environment, in the health ecosystem, are there aligned incentives related to driving innovation in order to improve their outcomes? And what we found was self-funded health plans. I mentioned them before, which are these enterprises that take on the health risk associated with their employees. And it's a big segment. It covers 60% of private sector employees. It's, probably 2/3 of the $4 trillion that we spend on healthcare market is attributed to private insurance. So it's a big number. And what we're looking at is, how do you drive the cost element associated with the healthcare benefits with the business objectives? So think of like an energy company, like a big energy company, and this is actually in part of our customer discovery. We spoke to one of these companies where they have line workers, and those line workers are the ones who increase revenue for them if they have increased utilization, right? They're out fixing the lines, they're critical to their top line revenue. Well, what they do is they actually provide iPads and physical therapy services for free for those line workers, because they realize it keeps them out and out doing revenue kind of work, rather than having them to come back into an office and do PT.
Right.
And that's an important element. So they can increase their healthcare costs a little bit, but it allows them to better reach their business objectives. Right. So what we're thinking about is, how do you align your healthcare benefits with your business objectives? Nobody is looking at this segment. What they're looking at is, how can I minimize my healthcare benefits, make my employees pay more, beat up the third-party administrators, those kinds of things. So I know I'm getting into a lot of detail here and a lot of weeds, but what we're doing is we're talking to customers, a lot of customers. We're talking to consultants and third-party administrators. And what we're doing is we're removing areas that aren't interesting to us, like MCOs and health systems, and really focusing on this process of, how do we create a tie between the healthcare benefits and the business objectives for these enterprises? I don't know where it goes from here. So that's the end of the story, because we haven't figured it out yet. But that's the process that we've been going through for the past 6 months. And hopefully that's helpful to people on this podcast.
For sure. And there's three things immediately that jump out to me. Two of them have to do with incentives. So you talk about these incentives that are misaligned to the company's objectives. So I think what the audience can take away is that you have two ways to react to discovering that issue with incentives. You can either align yourself with the incentives. You described how a lot in healthcare, they've identified that adding headcount increases revenue. So if there's a way to be a part of that aspect of that industry where you're helping to do that thing, you've aligned yourself with the incentives. The other way of dealing with that, and it sounds like this is what you're doing, is you're trying to realign the incentives so that they're actually more beneficial, or by focusing on that, it actually provides more benefit to not only the business, but also to the insured person, right? Because if in the scenario you described, where line workers are able to spend less time in the office doing PT, and they're able to actually spend more time doing productive stuff, and frankly, they're not doing the things they don't want, because I know a lot of these guys, and if you tell a line worker he's got to go be in the office and not be out in the field, they're probably going to get a little grumpy. They're wired that way, no pun intended. And so you've aligned the incentives more appropriately so that there's more of a win-win. And I would say that's probably a bigger challenge than just aligning yourself with the incentives. But I would also imagine the rewards can be much greater if you can realign the incentives. It's like rerouting a river a little bit. If you can reroute a river to your desired location, well, then you can make that desired location enormously wealthy, right? If we're thinking about, the way that the United States especially is built. If you follow the rivers, you follow major metropolitan areas, right? You'll find them all along it. So that's the way that I'm envisioning this. Are we kind of on the same page? Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, no. It's totally, you're spot on. And the other thing that I would just say is, we're looking at different segments of programs. Like, is there a way? So one of the big things these days is something called GLP-1 for obesity and weight loss. And Ozempic and other brands are examples of these GLP-1s. Hugely costly for anybody who is on these. If literally thousands and tens of thousands of dollars a month and tens of thousands of dollars a year. And so most employer groups or managed care organizations do not offer that, right? But if you know that it has profound impact on your the health of your employees in this case, where it had obesity is shown to cause multiple acuities, so diabetes and cardiovascular disease and things like that. If you know that will reduce the multiple acuities associated with obesity, and you know that the average tenure of your workers is 10 years, then it may be worthwhile for you to offer that, because you'll reap the benefits over the next 5 years. On the flip side, if your average tenure of your employees, of your workforce, is only 2 years, then you have to figure out a different way to deploy that, because they will not achieve the benefit, right? The enterprise in this case wouldn't achieve the benefit of that particular investment in the weight loss drug. So making sure that things are aligned incentive-wise and going to where the waters open up, if you will, but making sure that you understand where the different points of inflection are based on the enterprise's needs is exactly the kind of thing that we're looking at.
Well, Steve, and that's why I'm finding this conversation so interesting, because what this requires, what you're describing, is a holistic re-envisioning of how organizations look at those incentives over a longer term. And if you think about, people, we use the term human capital, just like any other type of capital. If I've got a machine that I expect to have in my manufacturing plant for 10 years, and I know I'm going to have to spend, let's say, 100 grand to make a repair. Well, it's worth it to me if that machine is going to make me, $10 million and I'm going to have it for 10 years. But to your point, if I'm only going to have that machine for another 18 months, maybe the 100 grand isn't worth it. So I've got to figure out how to do one of two things. I've got to figure out how to extend the lifespan of that machine or increase its productivity. Same thing with human capital. If I have an average tenure of 2 years, I'm either, to your point, I'm going to have to figure out how to cut my cost in maintaining that because I won't reap the benefits of that human capital, or right? I've got to figure out how to extend the life cycle. And I'm not to talk about human life, but the lifespan of that person, that human capital with my organization. So I've got to address company culture, right? I've got to address things like compensation, right? I've got to
Right.
address all those things so that I can then say, all right, we've extended our average tenure. Now it makes a lot of sense that we're putting all this investment, which allows us to get greater results at a business level because we've got longer term employees. They're happier to work here. They're more
Definitely.
engaged. They're healthier. And so this holistic approach, this complete reimagining of how we build teams and grow organizations is what's going to be required, because we've kind of reached, and this is me now just spitballing here, but in my opinion, we've kind of reached the current ability for a person to extend themselves under the current conditions, right? We can't really work anymore. We can't be more connected to our work. We've got these daggum things which follow us around all the
Right.
time. So we work all the time. So we're going to have to improve the machines if we're going to get more productivity out of those machines. So
Yeah, that's very well said. And two things that I would just add to it. First of all, my friend and ex economics professor from grad school would love that conversation that you just what you just stated, because he always talked about marginal utility and marginal cost, basic economics 101 kinds of things. And, I never thought economics was terribly applicable when I took it. And it's all around us. And what you just described was exactly that, and absolutely agree. The other thing is that you mentioned something about corporate culture, and CEOs are just sort of renowned for saying, what's our number one asset? Not that people are assets, but what's our number one, what's the most critical piece of our company? And it's people, right?
Right.
Without the right people in the right seats doing the right things, then it's one of these things that we're need to invest in them, right? And invest in the culture, and being able to tie these things together in a way where you're doing good. The CEO of this very large power system, I was having lunch with him, and I was describing to him what we were talking about, and he goes, "So what you're telling me is we can do good and do well at the same time?" Exactly.
Perfect.
Because it's the right thing to do for your employees and their families. Plus, by tying it to the business objectives, you actually can do things like increase your top line revenue, right? Another example on the power line kind of program, where they bring dermatologists out into the field to do checking, right? Rather than having each of the line workers have to go into an office, a central office, to do this, they bring dermatology. Is it more expensive? Absolutely. than if they were to go into the dermatologist's office? Absolutely. But guess what? Overall, the business is much better off as a result of being able to bring providers to your employees. Everybody's happier.
Mm-hmm.
The line workers are happier, right? You're doing much more preventative maintenance, right, on these things that can potentially cause, very harmful impact, right, to the employees. Anyway, so I'm now off my high horse. I've been on a high horse here for the past 20 minutes or so, but hopefully that's helpful to you
It's
and to
super
your
helpful.
audience.
No, this is super helpful. Look, and folks, if you're watching this, if you're listening to this, I want you to chime in on this. What I believe, what I've learned from our audience is that there are a lot of curious minds. There's a lot of I like the term curious is one of the most I think it's the highest compliments that you can pay somebody. A person's very curious, and I think what we've done, what we've presented with this conversation, is we've presented a different way and a different lens through which to look at one's industry. We talk about it. We're talking about it in the context of healthcare. But this is super applicable, this paradigm, this lens to look at your own business. If you're in manufacturing, if you're in lawn care, right? There's a way to think about, and there's value in thinking about how can I either align my business with the current incentive structure, or how can I redirect by reimagining the incentives so that I'm rerouting that river to someplace much more profitable. So Steve,
Let me,
oh yeah, go
yeah,
ahead. Yeah.
let me add two other really quick things in terms of mistakes that I've made, and sort of new thinking that may be helpful to people listening to this. One is, I've been associated with companies where we focused on problems when we're going and approaching the market. We're focusing on problems 6 months from now, not the problems that are at hand. Meaning, sometimes you look and you go, okay, that potentially is a problem, and so we need to fix that. And what I would say is that you need to figure out what you need to do to get there, but don't focus on that problem. Always have one eye on the problem,
Mhm.
but don't necessarily focus on the problem. And I'll give you a quick example of one of the companies I was with where we created a $500,000 database for our customers because we were going to be the fastest to $1 billion in revenue of any company in the history of the PC industry. And so we spent $500,000, which is a lot of cash in an early stage company, just on a database. And you know what? We never needed that Mac Daddy database. We didn't need to have that big of a database. And we could have used that cash, for other means, marketing or whatever we needed in order to promote them. So that's one thing. Always have an eye 6 months from now, but focus on the problems that are at hand. The other thing that I would tell you that I've seen in terms of challenges for me personally are communications and transparency, and making sure that everybody in the organization is really well informed of what's working, what's not working. There's a lot of fits and starts that happen, as you know, with new products, new services, new businesses, your existing business. Over communication is the right way to do it, and make sure everybody is aligned with that. Because you're going, it's not a straight line between where you are and where you want to be. That I can guarantee you. It is a circuitous line. And so you all need to be going on these curves together. If you're not, if somebody is zigging while you're zagging, it causes huge amounts of issues associated with being able to deploy things in a really comprehensive way, if you will. So, and it also has to be something. I read a book recently called The Power of Giving Power, which is a great book. And they talk about pyramid structures versus constellation structures. I encourage people to read it. And I'm now a full believer in constellation-based mentality and structures, where pyramid is top down, here's what's going to happen, and that's it. Constellation is, here are the guide rails for us, and being able to allow you, Reade, to go off within those guide rails and do what you think is the most necessary thing for your particular environment. Have you ever heard of something called Burning Man?
Yeah.
It's an annual gathering out in the desert, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
They do this perfectly, where they have literally like 70,000 people. I think they have like 70 different camps, and each camp is responsible for their own environment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they do. It wasn't one person who created Burning Man and said, this is the way we're going to do it. Let's set up all these committees and all this other stuff. It was like, here's the overall structure, and then here are all the different camps that people within those constructs know what they want to do, and they take a lot of liberties, but it's within the constructs of the Burning Man structure, and which I think is fascinating. So that's my other part, is focusing on problems that are at hand and making sure that you communicate, and there's full transparency associated with it.
Well, Steve, I think our audience is going to get a ton of great takeaways. The two most important ones are, number one, blame Steve for updates. And number two, the business lessons from Burning Man. I don't think I can say that we've done that one before. So, Steve, thank you so very much for joining us on the Grow Rogue podcast. I really hope that we can talk again about some of these topics. This has been really interesting for me. I know it's been really interesting for the audience. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much. It really was a lot of fun to talk to you and frankly, get to know you better too. So really appreciate that as well.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, you should definitely check out this one right here. You're going to get a lot of value out of this one. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you click on this link right here to do that. And then if you just want to dive into our other content, check out the playlist right here. Thanks so much.